In the last 60 years, there have been enormous changes in the maritime industry. More merchant ships than ever sail the oceans, feeding the markets of a growing global economy. However, the rights of seafarers have failed to keep up with this changing industry, becoming entangled in a mess of complex legislation and rules. Until now. The 26th of February 2006 saw the launch of a groundbreaking piece of international legislation, the Maritime Labour Convention. Put in place by the International Labour Organization, the convention was largely initiated by the industry itself, now hailed as being a Bill of Rights. This document for the first time provides comprehensive rights and protection at work for the world's 1.2 million seafarers. The convention is supported by industry and governments and is being ratified by an increasing number of countries. Cleopatra Doumbia Henry, Director of the International Labour Standards Department of the ILO, has overseen the development of the MLC from the beginning.
For ship owners and seafarers, it's also a good convention because it seeks to set out in a very clear format a clear set of rules in a way that is quite accessible and also with solutions that meet their concerns. It has a strong enforcement arm and it has mechanisms for keeping that convention up to date.
The MLC replaces the often confusing tangle of 40 conventions and 29 recommendations that had accumulated over time with a clear, simple and practical framework. Everyone working in and associated with the industry, from the newest rating to government ministers, will benefit from it. This really is something radically new and will effectively change the way we operate in this dynamic industry.
I have been mostly on tankers, so maybe all the masters will not share my view. But one thing I do note the Maritime Labour Convention will positively enforce is the compliance with the hours of work and rest.
The very strong points of the MLC is that it captures and focuses on all the labor elements of the seafarers.
The MLC is a very welcome piece of international legislation. It will set the benchmark, really, for seafarers' rights for the future.
What it does allow is for the inspector to be more thorough in looking at the various areas covered by the MLC and to identify the problems more easily than previously.
The MLC is going to encourage people to join the industry because they should be assured that they do have a universally applied instrument within which they can work.
So how is the MLC going to be different? Why is it more than yet another official set of rules and regulations to be filed out of sight and out of mind? The strength of the MLC is that for the first time we have a universal set of rules for employers and employees throughout the world that is accessible and user-friendly. It will be far easier for governments and flag states to monitor the rules, for companies to implement them, and for ships' officers to put them into practice. In other words, it will be impossible for people to cheat. There is positively no escape, whether the flag state has ratified the convention or not. Not a problem for responsible ship owners and managers, but in a global industry where the nature of its business makes policing standards difficult and challenging, the MLC should help to drive bad operators from the seas.
Well, that has been certainly one of its most important objectives, to try and stamp out the substandard ships, the really bad operators who are unscrupulous and do not respect, do not care about international standards. Certainly even less labour standards.
So what is the new convention? At its heart, the Maritime Labour Convention provides a comprehensive set of mandatory standards for seafarers, employment conditions and rights. It clarifies employers' responsibilities and enables fair competition within the industry by establishing minimum labour standards that all must meet and comply with. These core rights and principles contained in the Articles of the Convention are underpinned by a code divided into 5 sections called titles. Each title in turn contains the relevant regulations, mandatory standards and non-mandatory guidelines, which describe in detail how the convention must be implemented. Title 1. Minimum requirements for seafarers to work on a ship. Title 2. Conditions of employment. Title 3. Accommodation, recreation facilities, food and catering. Title 4. Health protection, medical care, welfare and social security protection. Title 5. Compliance and enforcement, designing in compliance, design and construction costs, substantial equivalence.
It provides the 4th pillar of legislation for the shipping industry alongside SOLAS, MARPOL and STCW. It will ensure that seafarers' working and living conditions are maintained in accordance with the fundamental rights as detailed by the International Labour Organization, and will ensure a level playing field for seafarers regardless of the nationality of the ship they're sailing on, their nationality or the trade in which the ship is employed.
However, it's all very well introducing a radical new set of measures, but how do you implement and enforce it in a global context? As a starting point, the target for any enforcement is the ship itself. To ensure that the vessel complies with the MLC rules, it must carry certain key pieces of documentation when arriving at port, whether it's a port in the vessel's country of registration or port state anywhere in the world. These documents are the Maritime Labour Certificate, MLC, which proves that the ship has been inspected and verified to be in compliance with the requirements of the Convention. The Declaration of Maritime Labour Compliance, DMLC, that confirms that all employment, health and safety, welfare and manning issues comply with the MLC. A copy of the ILO Maritime Labour Convention, and all other documentation that relates to SOLAS, MARPOL and STCW. And should inspectors find that a vessel does not conform to the rules and conditions of any of these regulations, they have the power to detain the ship.
This is not a light decision to take. When a surveyor detains a vessel or prevents a vessel from going to sea, it has a knock-on effect throughout the port. For example, if there's a busy port, it can tie a berth up for a day or two. It would have an effect on the future trading pattern of the ship, because if it's on charter, it may miss its slots. And in addition, it will go on the vessel's record.
Compliance with the MLC is not a problem. The rules, standards and obligations are clearly laid out and simply reflect a long tradition of improvement within the industry. But if you're in any doubt of the consequences of not complying, then think of this. Most of the penalties for non-compliance are nothing new. The difference now is that the MLC gives the relevant authorities much sharper teeth to bite down on substandard practices. With more specified standards and the need for stricter documentation, a ship can be detained far more easily. The cost in terms of lost cargo, breach of contract and commercial prestige far outweigh any temptation to disregard the MLC rules. Until now, port states have sometimes taken different views on vessel seaworthiness, accommodation, living conditions, even the age and training of crews. The MLC, in bringing new universally recognized rules, will clarify what grounds for action port inspectors can follow, with no one receiving favourable treatment.
No more favourable treatment means, in essence, that you treat everyone the same, regardless of the flag, the nationality of the crew, the type of ship. Everyone is treated exactly the same.
Another term often heard is substantial equivalence. In essence, this is the way in which an acceptable compromise can be reached within the rules of the MLC Convention. A good example would be medical certification, which the MLC requires to be valid for a maximum of 2 years. However, a flag state may adopt a substantially equivalent provision if under its national laws a medical certificate shall only be valid for a maximum of 1 year. The core requirements of the MLC in this case are still being met, as the position adopted by the flag state exceeds the requirements of the MLC. Therefore, it is deemed to be substantially equivalent. And if you want a far simpler example, then how about this?
There is a requirement for cold stores to be provided on ships, which are equipped with refrigeration equipment. On smaller vessels with small crews, a substantial equivalence may be considered to be the provision of deep freezers and fridges instead of a full-size cold storeroom.
So we've outlined some of the core principles of the convention. Let's see how they impact on you. Captain Doug Bell, Deputy Director of the Bahamas Maritime Authority, is a leading expert on the role of the flag state.
Well, flag state is the first line of defence. We're the ones that set the standards, produce the legislation in conjunction with the MLC, or to comply with the MLC. With the earlier conventions, without the need for certification, there was no uniform method of application. Now, having to comply with certification requirements, in fact, it should ensure that all the flag state inspectors, from whichever flag state they come from, are applying the same standards. Standards have been agreed, guidelines have been agreed, both for the flag states and the port states. And with those being applied, then we will know when our ships go into any port in the world that these standards will be applied in a uniform manner. The major difference between this convention and all of the previous ILO maritime conventions is the fact that it can be enforced. There is a certification provision and there is an inspection regime which hasn't been present before. Every ship will now have to be surveyed and inspected at least every 5 years, and a certificate issued to demonstrate that it does comply. This is a totally new provision.
Mr. Spiros M. Polemis, ship owner and president of the International Shipping Federation, has been an influential voice in the drafting of the MLC.
It was the ship owners who first thought of the idea of consolidating all the different ILO instruments, and therefore they are very much involved in the creation of the MLC. It is very important, and of course in the past ship owners were compliant with the various ILO instruments, and now of course they have to be compliant with the provisions of the MLC. I think all of these instruments, all of these conventions help because it certainly will make for raising the standards of the industry because it provides the right framework within which people will have to work. And we hope that the MLC is going to be instrumental in eliminating any operators which are not up to standard. We hope that the MLC is going to encourage people to join the industry because it provides a universal framework for employers to be able to offer the right wages to the crew members, and it is also universally applied, and it is a legal standard right across the world.
As chairman and CEO of Philippine Transmarine Carriers, Mr. Carlos Salinas views the MLC as a major advance in the recruitment, welfare and retention of seafarers.
Will all these new procedures be something that would be that would attract seafarers maybe more to the industry? The answer would be yes, because now they can see that there is a big move towards the improvement of working conditions, terms and conditions of employment. Labor supplying states that may not ratify the convention might encounter problems, especially in the deployment of their own crew members to other flag states, because then the flag state will ensure or will want to make sure that the labor supplying country complies. It will create a situation where there would have to be better organization perhaps of documents, because all these documents have to be prepared and have to be available for inspection. And owners more and more knowing that there will be audits and possibly assessments will ensure that all these documents are in place. In many ways, it can be a wake-up call, that these are now international requirements. Flag states have to ensure that this is all in place. Labor supplying countries have their responsibilities, and then it flows to the mining agent to ensure that all the requirements up the line are all fulfilled.
How's your heading?
28279.
Hard to port.
Out to port.
Captain Vishal Singh, Projects and Operations Officer V-Ships, draws on years of personal experience as a master when ensuring that their ships meet all the requirements of a modern and efficient fleet, crewed by a highly trained and professional workforce. For him, the Maritime Labour Convention represents a practical new set of tools for the 21st century maritime industry.
With the convention coming in force, the paperwork and documentation would be extremely important, because the procedures we follow on board the vessel to comply with the Maritime Labour Convention requires us to keep documentation and records. Even before the Maritime Labour Convention, we were required to post watchkeeping schedules in port and at sea. We were required to maintain hours of work and rest for our seafarers. But with the MLC becoming a mandatory requirement now, I foresee Port Strait Control inspectors boarding ships and cross-referencing the actual contents of our hours of work and rest. It is going to be very, very positive for reducing the number of accidents we have related to human error, fatigue, stress. But one thing I do foresee is that with the MLC coming into force, the existing seafarers on board the vessel who choose to move ashore because of the living conditions and the workloads and pressures on board the vessel might decide to stay on a little more longer on board the vessel. So in principle, we might have a positive impact on retention. It is going to harmonize the way our seafarers are treated on board the vessel and the way they operate on board the vessel when it comes to their accommodation, recreation, employment rights, welfare, medical allowances, on-board training, and things like that. So in essence, the Maritime Labour Convention is a very good thing that has happened to the seafarer, and it should have happened about 40 years ago.
Neil Atkinson of the Maritime and Coast Guard Agency sees an important change of role for himself and his colleagues because of the MLC.
The surveyor's role will change due to the MLC, because up until now we've concentrated on the structural side of the ship, such as crew accommodation, hull, whereas with the MLC 2006 we've got to concentrate equally as much on items such as wages, employment contracts and complaints. The MLC introduces two new concepts. One is an onboard complaints procedure, the use of the crew if they consider there's been a breach of the conditions of the Maritime Labour Convention. The second is for the seafarer or for the seafarers' organisation to complain directly to either a flag state or a port state about conditions on board a particular ship. This will make complaint handling more efficient and more effective, and will help to improve the working and living conditions for the individual seafarers.
The maritime industry and the ILO want a merchant fleet of the 21st century. efficient, safe and attractive as a career. It's vitally important to encourage recruitment of new seafarers while retaining the experienced workforce in this exciting and growing profession. The MLC has given the maritime industry a fresh start for the challenges of tomorrow.
In a sense, the result, I would say, is one of ownership. All constituents, whether they be governments, ship owners and seafarers, I can truly say own the result, which is that the text of the Maritime Labour Convention 2006.
The MLC is the industry's friend, but unlike much legislation that has come before, this has very sharp teeth indeed. It is a reality, it is global, it is tough, and if you don't take it on board, it will certainly cost you. But comply, and it's good news for everyone.